Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Tax in 10 with me, Rachel de Souza, and Andrew Robbins. We are both tax partners in RSM's London office and have a wealth of experience in dealing with a wide range of private client matters. Your feedback is valuable to us, so do keep it coming, especially if you have thoughts on any topics you would like us to cover. Now, this week, I want to talk about a topic which is not directly tax related, but certainly has implications for all of our clients' tax affairs. And that's that the European Union Court of Justice has recently ruled that public registers related to company ownership and so on are in breach of the owner's fundamental rights. Now, this was a surprise, not just to me, but seemingly to most of the professional community, because the direction of travel recently has been towards transparency. So this ruling seems to have well and truly slammed the brakes on that.
Of course, I mean, you could say it's irrelevant to us because the UK is no longer subject to the ruling of the ECRJ anyway. So technically, the UK government doesn't have to take any notice of any of this. But I agree, it'll be interesting to see what, if anything, does change in practice. There is this real sort of philosophical debate to be had, I think, between the public's right to know and the individual's right to privacy. And it's actually not that easy to balance the two things out.
Hang on, now, before we get too philosophical, let's just remind ourselves what registers we have in the UK and why we have them as well. And I think the first register which was introduced was back in April 2016, and that was the Persons of Significant Control Register. And this is intended to identify the real owners of UK companies, and anyone with more than 25% control has to be disclosed on that register. And this one's kept at Companies House, with the information being freely available to everyone. And the point of the PSC register is to provide transparency about the control of UK companies, to assist in preventing money laundering, tax evasion, and generally to assist in law enforcement.
Yeah, and the PSC is a good example where transparency is genuinely important because, I mean, for example, if I want to check whether a new client is involved in money laundering, being able to understand what companies he controls indirectly could be a big help. On the other hand, there are lots of good reasons why owners may not want the world to have access to their shareholding arrangements. And maybe we can talk about those in a minute. The PSC, of course, only covers UK companies, which is why more recently they've had to add to it with the Overseas Entity Register, which was introduced with the intention that it will capture the owners of non-UK resident entities which own UK real estate. Now, it's interesting because legislation was passed to authorize this back in 2016, but then it just sat on a shelf. And it was only implemented earlier this year in relation to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which I think suddenly made everybody remember, oh yes, we do have this legislation available, and made it quite urgent for UK authorities to know the ultimate beneficiary of UK real estate, because if you didn't know that, you couldn't impose sanctions on the Russian oligarch with their fancy pad.
Oh, that's right. And we shouldn't forget the trust register as well, which captures UK and foreign trusts which pay tax in the UK or have other UK business relationships. But in contrast to the other two registers, the information on this register isn't publicly available. It is only available to government departments and law enforcement agencies. So thinking about those registers, I mean, I do wonder what the implications of the ECRJ ruling might be.
Yeah, well, we know that certain EU countries, such as the Netherlands, have already taken steps to stop public access to their registers. Given the ruling, the rest of the EU is obviously going to have to fall in line with that. But, as I've already said, post-Brexit, the UK can go its own way. I think it's also interesting to think about the position of Crown dependencies, especially Jersey, Guernsey, Isle of Man. One of the selling points, I think, for those jurisdictions, for me as an advisor, is that they've worked really hard to apply best practice in terms of money laundering and other regulations, which includes being, really on the cutting edge of international information exchange. So, as an example, Jersey already has its own beneficial ownership register in relation of locally incorporated companies. And it was actually in the process of allowing public access to this in the run up to this ruling. So Jersey is now going to have to decide whether to go ahead with that or whether to keep the information private, which ironically, having less transparency will make them more in line with the EU position.
Yes, that's true. And of course, the UK government has got to consider its policy in light of these developments.
Yeah.
The UK pushed hard internationally for increased transparency and information exchange between governments, but that is a different question to transparency for the general public. And you're right, there is an interesting philosophical choice here, which is whether the right to privacy trumps the right to transparency. And we also know that different cultures have different answers, to this question. So, for example, it is the norm in Norway for your tax return to be publicly available. But can you imagine the outcry if that was suggested here? We also know that security is a genuine concern for the very wealthy, and being able to find out details of where somebody lives or what assets they own obviously makes them more vulnerable. There are also arguments that giving public information out about somebody's wealth encourages tall poppy syndrome, where people who stand out are socially ostracised. And finally, there is the fundamental point of why should I have to tell you how well, or indeed how badly I am doing? It's just none of your business.
Yeah. The other side of the coin, though, is there are really good reasons to encourage transparency. So picking up on the wealth point, knowing your peer's salary can actually be crucial in allowing you to demand equality in pay and conditions. It's also essential if we want to be able to uncover tax evasion or money laundering and, just generally hold people to account for their behavior. And there is the argument that if you've done nothing wrong and have nothing to hide, why not make your affairs public? Now, I have to admit, personally, I feel a bit torn about this because in principle, I am all in favour of maximum transparency. On the other hand, as a sort of quintessential button-up Brit, the idea of anybody knowing about my personal affairs does bring me out in hives.
Of course, it's too early to tell what the UK government's reaction will be. But what we can say for sure is that whether they remain public or become private, the existing registers are going to continue. And of course, we may well see new ones popping up over time.
Yeah.
So public transparency may or may not happen, but transparency between countries is here to stay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, do you have a nice recommendation for us this week, Andrew?
A nice recommendation for you. Well,
as opposed to a horrid one, yes.
How about a nice podcast?
Go on then.
It's got a horrible name because this is the slate.com Cultural Gab Fest, which is just horrible. Okay. But Cultural Gab Fest is a weekly podcast which talks about cultural matters, funnily enough. And it's an American podcast, but it's mainly focused on cinema, TV, music, sort of popular culture, but with a sort of a slightly academic, critical twist to it. So anything from Beyonce's last album through to more obscure films or streaming TV. Really interesting, thought-provoking conversations about cultural issues, and just a good way to make you aware of what's going on out there. So I'd heartily
Okay.
recommend.
Sounds good to me. Thank you all for listening. Please do let us have your comments or feedback as usual, and we can be contacted on rachel.d'Souza@rsmuk.dom or andrew.robbins@rsmuk.com. Bye for now.
Bye.